Excellent. My name is Mike Gifford, and I am a senior strategist at Civic Actions. I've been involved in accessibility really since 2009 with the Drupal community. I took on the challenge of trying to go off and make Drupal as accessible as it could be. And I thought it would be a matter of maybe a year or two of effort, and here we are. And it's definitely nowhere near as accessible as we'd like it to be, but still more accessible than pretty much anything else. And that got me involved actually in organizing an early GAAD event. GAAD is, of course, the Global Accessibility Awareness Day, which is what we're celebrating today. I organized a unconference that included one of the founders of GAAD, Genevieve. And this was, I think, just in 2012, which was one of the early, right after it started. So I've been involved in this community for a long time, and it's been really interesting to see it grow. I've also been quite involved in civic tech and government technology, and at Civic Actions we do again quite a lot of work with VA and CMS and NSF and others. But I've also been involved in the Digital Services Coalition, both as a member of trying to go from a member and user of the participant in the community, but also as a member of the board, and most recently in the past year as president of the board. And if people aren't familiar with the Digital Services Coalition, it's a great organization to try and support small businesses and allow people who allow for innovation and open source and alternative ways of going off and meeting the needs of citizens as effectively as possible. There's definitely a lot more we can tell you about the Digital Services Coalition, but I'm not going to dwell on that. Our website is digitalservicescoalition.org. We have a number of panelists who are all going to go off and give themselves they're going to do an introduction, and then I'm going to ask some questions. But then we're going to have space for people to other people in the audience to ask questions. So please go off and drop your questions when you have them inside the chat, so we'll be able to look at those and vet those, and I will try and answer as many of them as I can, or sorry, our panel will try and answer as many of them as possible during the presentation. But if we are not able to go off and answer them during the panel, we will try and go off and follow up afterwards to provide answers to those. And so please keep them coming. We have in terms of our speakers, we have Nicshan Floyd, who's the Deputy Director of Customer Experience of DHS, Genevieve Gaudet, who's the Director of Design from Nava PBC, Amy Cole, who's the Global Accessibility Manager at Bixal, and Andrew Nielson, who's the Director of Government-Wide IT Accessibility Programs at the GSA. So maybe I can just start by passing this over to Andrew to go off and to give a bit more of a introduction to what he does, and also what are the accessibility issues or efforts that you're excited by. What are the things and initiatives that you're excited by within your field and your organization and your workflow?
Yeah, well, thank you, Mike. Yeah, so as Mike mentioned, I'm the director of the government-wide IT accessibility program, which sits in the General Services Administration's Office of Government-Wide Policy. And my organization, our GSA, and my program by delegation, we share a responsibility together with the United States Access Board to provide technical assistance to agencies and really to anyone in the world, stated in the legislation, in law, that we are to provide technical assistance in meeting the requirements of Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which requires federal agencies to make our IT accessible to people with disabilities. We also have a somewhat new responsibility, also written into law, to provide an annual assessment and report to Congress on government-wide accessibility of federal, and that includes our web pages, our hardware, printers, faxes, if fax machines exist anymore, and software, mobile devices and mobile applications that we produce or use in the federal government. So the primary method we use to provide technical assistance with a small team is via the website that we maintain, section508.gov. And we have a lot of training and guidance documents there. And we also provide some tools. One of the tools we provide is an accessibility requirements tool, primarily intended for procurement professionals to identify, or business analysts to identify what requirements and solicitation language that I should include in a solicitation to make sure that when I bid for a service or product, that I make sure that I stipulate that those products to be delivered under under a contract are accessible. We also, speaking to some of the things we're excited about, I am excited about that annual report. Some of the agencies that are reporting, I think, also are excited, but also are dealing with new data calls, or this as a new data call. But general feedback we've received from those who are delivering or submitting data is that this is a very useful exercise for them in their efforts to promote accessibility at their agencies and to have meaningful conversations with leadership about appropriately staffing and budgeting to ensure that our IT is accessible. So I am excited about that. Another initiative among the tools that we also provide to agencies and outside of agencies to the public as well is one that Mike was engaged with us in a couple of years ago and still ongoing and new traction. It's related to efforts around creating a machine readable version of an accessibility conformance report. So not only creating the data schema for that, but we are currently developing an ACR, or accessibility conformance report repository, to encourage product owners, vendors, not only to provide their ACRs in a machine readable format, but then to make them available in a central index or repository that we're also building an application programming interface to then make that data available to marketplaces, whether we're talking about Best Buy or Walmart or Amazon or our federal marketplaces, where we go to get information about IT that we want to buy. We want to make accessibility information just as easily accessible, easy to get and find and review when I'm making my decisions based on other information like specifications and product description. So that's an initiative we're excited about and hope to encourage adoption. And we'll take adoption both on the buyer end and on the product vendor end. But so that's enough of an introduction and things that excite me. There's a lot more to talk about. I'll give it back.
That's great, Nicshan. Or sorry, Andrew. Nicshan, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Nicshan, for the Deputy Director for the Customer Experience Directorate. And usually when you go and you talk to agencies and you talk to vendors that support federal agencies, they tend to like to talk about Section 508. And so we make sure that things are accessible. But we often know that when you work in the world of reality, sometimes things can be accessible in accordance to the standards, but not very usable. This has been one of those things that's always plagued me, because I've always wanted to make sure that individuals have the best possible experience when using an application or services that were being provided. So fortunately, about a year ago, I got approached by Dana Shisno, who is the executive director of CXD, and she said we should join forces. So we took the Office of Accessible Systems and Technology and we merged it with CXD for the first time, what I believe is we're able to really focus on all the key areas that may impact a user. When we talk about the customer's experience, we're looking at the individual and the whole. So we're looking at their digital touch points, which would be those things that Section 508 would impact. We're looking at those physical touch points. We're also looking at those human interactions. So one of the things that we want to do is we want to make sure that everyone gets to a higher level of literacy, understands their role and responsibility as it relates to building more human-centric products and services. To aid within that, we have built over 25 courses. So we have how to create accessible electronic documents using Microsoft Office products and Adobe Acrobat Professional. We have the usability testing demystified, accessibility plain language. So how do you write in a way that conveys clearly and effectively your messages? So regardless of someone's literacy level, you're able to communicate effectively to them. And then of course we have the Certified Trusted Tester program, which we've built and maintained since 2009. And with that program, you're able to learn how to use various types of testing tools and visual verification to essentially validate that an application or a web page is Section 508 conformant or not. Future opportunities, we'd like to work towards building a trusted tester process for mobile applications. If we look at OMB 24-08, there's a call out to DHS to try to build a certification course for electronic documents. I've served as the co-chair of the Accessible Electronic Documents Community of Practice, and we just worked on the baseline test process for electronic content. So we're looking forward to being able to use that document once it's blessed by the Access Board to help build the Certified Trusted Tester course for electronic content. A lot of times when people get brought in to, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, we need to go off and jump to the questions, but please finish up, Nicshan, and then we'll move on.
No, we can, let's go ahead and continue with introductions and we can hit this later.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Amy, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. And thanks for having me here today. My name's Amy Cole. I'm the Digital Accessibility Manager at Bixal, and I've been in the federal space probably not as long as my fellow panelists, coming up on about 2 years. Before that, I was at the state level. I'm located out of Arkansas, and so I worked for the Division of Agriculture in Arkansas for about 9 years and started my journey of accessibility and starting to make things like higher education and free public resources and research resources available to the public. PDFs were the bane of my existence. So anything that's going to help make PDFs more accessible or just get rid of them entirely, or they're trying to turn them into web pages, anything like that's going to be excellent. So I'm always interested in something like that, just because they are often just a barrier, an unnecessary barrier. And that is something that I work on at Bixal, taking things like multi-step forms, sometimes it's a benefits form or other type of important forms, and turning them into a digital or interactive form that's more mobile friendly, something that somebody doesn't have to print or have access to a printer, for example. So anything like that, stuff that you wouldn't think we'd still be talking about in 2024, but we are. But just moving things into the correct century and meeting people where they are. The other thing that I've been excited to work on recently is usability testing with people with disabilities. I've just got off the monthly call for USWDS, so I am a member of the design system team, and the intersection of the compliance work that my team member and I do for making like the checklist for accessibility, making sure that we literally check the boxes of a checklist to make sure something is compliant is one part of it. But unless you're doing usability testing, especially with people with disabilities, you're never going to have that full picture. You're going to say, yeah, technically it passes, but is it really usable? So making sure it's like a delightful experience, making sure that it's usable and functional and just realistic, because I think WCAG does as good a job as it can, but then at some point it's actually got to go into the user experience realm. And who cares if it really passes if it's not actually usable? And then in addition to that, the other thing that I'm excited to work on in the next year or so is multilingual accessibility and like kind of layering how people access content that's in another language and maybe how they're using a screen reader with a different language. Are developers coding it in such a way that it translates correctly? Does it make any sense in another language? There's a lot of words in English. It is a living language, and so people are adding to it all of the time. And stuff that we say in English really does not translate well in certain languages. And then actually making room for some languages, like Spanish takes up a lot more space than English. And so if you say, oh, I'm tight with the wording here, if you had thought about Spanish, for example, then it may not have enough room. So there's a lot of different things that we're hoping to explore in the future. So those are just some of them.
That's great. And Amy, thank you for double presenting, because I know you were presenting for the USWDS call just an hour ago, just before now. Genevieve, do you want to go next?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for having me on this amazing panel of such accomplished folks. Excuse me. Yeah, hey everybody. My name is Genevieve Gaudet. I'm Director of Design at Nava PBC. very happy to be here and really excited to hear what's on folks' minds in the audience. So excited to get to the questions at the end. Briefly, I'm coming from Nava. Nava is a public benefit corporation. We're a technology consultancy, and we work to make government services simple, effective, and more accessible, which we'll be digging in more today. And since our start in 2015 with healthcare.gov, which I think many of you are also involved with, we've helped agencies like CMS, so the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and the VA make really large sweeping improvements to how programs like Medicare serve tens of millions of beneficiaries, or how veterans access and receive care. We've also worked at the state and local levels doing things like helping California and New Jersey modernize their unemployment systems, or working with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to build the first ever digitally native paid family medical leave service. And throughout those projects, a core part of our approach, and even reflected in the mission, is a commitment to accessibility, but just in line with all of the other panelists here, sort of beyond how do we check those boxes, how do we meet the criteria and the controls, but also how are we thinking about that customer experience in terms of certainly the digital services. So are we providing a strong experience, but also from the service design lens? So are we providing fallback methods? Are we providing plain language, consistent service, regardless of the channel? And I think a really good example of this is a project we've been working on for a few years now with the GSA around improving the accessibility of login.gov in two ways. So if you're not familiar, login.gov is like a platform service that other federal services can use to authenticate and identity proof in order to use secure online services. And we're helping that team in two ways. First, we are working on how to improve online document authentication, including biometric selfie face matching, which is a big accessibility challenge, right? We want to make sure, of course, again, that we're checking those boxes, but also, are we providing information upfront to people? Do they know what's going on with their data? Is it predictable? Can we guide people through that? And then if that doesn't work for whatever reason, what are those fallback methods, right? What does that service design look like? So we have another team that's been working since 2022, I believe, with the GSA on in-person proofing. And so I think that's a really great example of a project where we're adding an in-person service, and we were doing that usability testing, that outreach that Amy was describing with folks with disabilities, with people who are going to have to travel somewhere, in this case to a post office, to do that in-person proofing. And over time,
I just wanted to if we could draw this to a close, would be great.
Sure. I was going to say, and over time, we've been able to go from that prototype to now 18,000 postal locations use that service across the country.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to go through and ask a question to one person and give them the opportunity to answer. But if everyone has a quick follow-up that they want to add, feel free to go up and jump in after they've had a chance to go up and answer the question. So the first one I'm going to ask to Amy. What needs to happen to see that more .gov sites are using the US WDS?
We gotta hire goons. No, gotta hire people to go out. No, really, it is I feel like it's making sure that teams know that we are there to help them. We're not there to force anybody really to do anything. We are a service, and we are there to help the community and make sure that if they have questions, we're available to help. I've been a part of teams before where it felt like people had to do something, and that was almost like it didn't make people want to do something, and so it made them drag their feet. So I think if we have the perception that we are a community, and we are also open to feedback, that's the best thing about the design system, is we're very open to feedback and suggestion. And we do meet regularly to talk about those things and to make sure that people know that they can contribute to it. And if something isn't working, it's a dialogue. It's not do as we say, and that's it. We definitely want to have a discussion about stuff, that if you have a concern about something, like, oh yeah, we definitely can improve that. So it's making sure that people feel that we are open and accessible to them. I think that's a good first step. As far as the rest of it goes, I think it's proving that the work that we do, first of all, does meet compliance and conformance, and back it up with data so that they can go to their teams or higher ups, whoever it is that is maybe being the roadblock to that, and saying, look, they have the data that says this actually does work, and this is the best avenue to go. And it's going to save everybody kind of time and effort, especially if you've got a small team of a developer team. If they've got a small team, then let us be that extra set of hands that they can help you out.
Yeah,
That's
hey,
great.
Mike,
Anyone want to add something? Go ahead, Andrew.
sorry, I probably should use the raise hand feature. I apologize for just jumping in. I was just going to add, the U.S. web design system is not technically required, but the 21st Century Integrated Digital Experience Act does require agencies to use the U.S. web design system maturity model, if I'm not mistaken, and Amy can correct me, to evaluate the maturity of and to improve overall digital experience. And that has encouraged in other ways the use of the U.S. web design system. So I think that's at least moving us in the right direction. But I think there's also room for some flexibility. I think another thing that is necessary to get more agencies to use it is to continue the great work that Amy and other of her teammates are doing to make that a platform that is very robust and flexible and usable. And that work is ongoing. It already has a plethora of components, but really what the underpinnings there are the design principles and the framework that it's built on, that you can use without having to use the components themselves. And that agencies can certainly make use of the US web design system in other ways than just the platform itself and using the different components. And so I think getting that word out, that it's useful as a resource in addition to the components and the platform itself, I think that will help agencies make use of the overall, its underpinnings, not just the individual components.
That's great. Does anyone else want to chime in this before we go on to the next question? Okay, then I think I will jump over to Nicshan with this question. How do we make sure that when we're talking about accessibility beyond Section 508, what does that mean and how do we drive that? How does the government make sure that they're able to actually deliver on accessibility beyond Section 508?
Yeah, that's always going to be a bit challenging because with Section 508, you have the law, we have standards, and we know that we can test against those standards to get an outcome. And we can show someone a test report that says, this is where you passed and this is where you fell. When we talk about developing or delivering a user experience, though, and we are looking at addressing some of those things that accessibility doesn't really, the standards themselves don't really cover very well, which is some of the cognitive disorders, which are some of the language challenges, which may be some of the enhanced navigational features that we can easily build in. Those things are actually going to tie back closer to good design and CX practices. So one of the things I always like to tell people to do is when you're out there doing discovery, when you're trying to identify a solution for whatever problem you're trying to solve, you need to think not just on what are my business requirements going to be, but who are my users? Who are the individuals in the margins? Who are those individuals with disabilities? And then you need to think about those requirements that are going to impact those individuals. And that needs to be a part of what you build your overarching design around. And then whenever you get to the phase where you actually are starting, you want to build out your prototypes. You want to conduct journey mapping because you want to see what those individuals need to go through and navigate through. And the one thing we don't want to do is we don't want to project and say, I'm going to today pretend that I'm a blind person, and I'm going to today pretend I'm a person who has a mobility impairment. There are situations where we can simulate those things, but whenever you can have someone actually in the room participating in those tests and giving you back feedback, this will better help shape you to build an overall better product.
That's wonderful. Does anyone else want to add on that? Then, Genevieve, did you want to jump in?
Oh, I was just going to add, I think this is a real plug for a method that we've been using at Nava that we certainly didn't invent it, but we found really helpful in this undertaking called participant advisory councils, so traditional user testing and usability testing will be, we recruit people for a round of testing, and we sit with them for maybe an hour or longer, however, which time we need, and we compensate them for that hour. And we've gotten a lot of value out of recruiting a cohort of participants that will follow us for maybe a quarter or 2 quarters, and we can pay them as consultants who have lived experience of navigating the world with this disability, with this context. And we find that they can not only weigh in on the different iterations, but we're able to go deeper to understand how does this fit into their lives and their circumstance. And that really gets us at that service design lens that Nicshan's talking about, and gives us a lot of those insights that Amy was referencing around, like really getting deep and understanding what's going to work for these folks. And when we make it more accessible for them, we really do lift the bar for everybody.
That's wonderful.
Mike, if you don't mind, I'll avoid the temptation to just tack on to every comment. But yeah, I think that it's really worthwhile to explore those types of approaches. I think involving individuals with disabilities as part of usability testing, I think invaluable. And there are lots of different ways to do that. And it's just so very useful, especially among an existing user base, to understand their needs while they're in their position from their perspective, and they happen to have a disability. It's like all of that combination can really help us make the products better. But I think those participant or user advisory councils, I think having the broader insight from a much broader perspective, and not tied to a specific usability test, I think also is very useful to inform business practices in addition to just a particular piece of software. And so I think, and then everywhere in between, informing design, and there are ways to engage throughout the process. So I love that approach of a participant advisory council, or I'm sorry, Genevieve, if I got that wrong, but those types of approaches I think are also just invaluable.
No, I do want to go up and have this be as interactive and engaging as possible. So no problem at all jumping in, Andrew. I think I can, but I can stop you from interrupting the next one, or jumping in the next one though, because I can ask you the next question, which is, there's been so many changes happening in the federal government around accessibility in the last 6 months. It's really been amazing to see this, but highlight some of the new carrots and sticks that are available for those who want to prioritize federal government accessibility. What are the things out there that are new thanks to all of the changes from the OMB, the GSA, Department of Justice? Just as quick as you can about trying to highlight some of those new items.
Yeah, I mentioned already the annual report that it was a new requirement as of last year, and we delivered our first annual report on government-wide federal T accessibility in December of last year, at the end of the year. So that, I think, both a carrot and a stick. There's an opportunity for agencies to highlight their accessibility. And also, we might be nervous about some increased intent and transparency if maybe we haven't done our homework. And that's just a natural effect of that type of reporting. So that's, I think, one highlight. I think a couple other highlights here.
And also just keep in mind that all of the agencies, all of that information is public. It's all transparent. There's a CSV file for it. You can look at your agency and see a PDF of the report card. Like, from a transparency point of view, it is a wonderful tool and a great example, and a whole lot of work. So I definitely appreciate that. But please.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. That's an excellent point to bring out. Not only is the report public, but all of the data that informs that information is also public. If you go to section 508.gov, you might have to traverse a little bit to find it. I can drop the link directly to last year's report into the chat as well. But that data is also available on section 508.gov and listed on data.gov, making that the data and the data itself available in a CSV and a JSON file. So you can do your own analysis. You can come to your own conclusions with that data as well. A couple other highlights from government: the Office of Management and Budget, the White House, issued 2 really important management directives, or memos, memos, last year. One towards the end of the fiscal year 23, and one towards the beginning of fiscal year 24. And I'll probably get these numbers wrong, but M20 and the names too, but M2322, a digital first public experience memo, which encourages agencies to of course make sure that our digital experiences are good experiences. Nick can probably speak a lot more to that from his seat as well. But really key in that memo is making accessibility just a prime focus of that memo. In other words, stating that accessibility it's when you say digital experience, accessibility is coming out of your mouth at the same time, or it should be. Another important memo, the M2408 or M2408 on improving management of Section 508 or improving accessibility. And in that memo gives agencies some specific direction about how to pay better attention and some specific tasks to complete to better address accessibility, including making sure that you have adequate accessibility statements and inform the public about how you address complaints and issues. Another is a direction to agencies to review all of their policies, not just your Section 508 policy or your IT policy, but any relevant policy, and ensure that there's adequate incorporation of accessibility, so that you're addressing accessibility not just when someone says Section 508, but when you're talking about public affairs or communications and website management. Not just when you're forced to think about 508, but when you're thinking about those other processes and policies to ensure that we're thinking about accessibility at the same time. So those are some.
That's
really
wonderful. Yeah. Nicshan, from your perspective at the DHS, do you find that there's things that jump out, or has Andrew covered it sufficiently in terms of things that are important to you as an agency, as a member of an agency, a leader in an agency?
Definitely. I think there's been a lot of excitement when we look at the president's management agenda and we look at the recent memos for OMB they're pushing. When I look at DHS, it's become a part of everything that we do at this point in time. Like any major program, project, service, or things that's being delivered or developed internally, we look at. And not only that, but we're starting to evaluate new tools that we bring in our environment. What's going to be the overarching impact? So like last year, we wanted to reduce burden hours. So we reduced 21 million burden hours. So that's looking at forms, how our forms completed, simplifying those forms to make it easier for people to complete those forms. Obviously ensure that they're Section 508 conformant as well. And now we're looking at doing the same exercise, but reducing another 10 million burden hours. We look at communication. So we're evaluating the use of AI tools to help with translation so that we can make sure that we're speaking to people in a natural language that they're accustomed to. And we're looking at those personal interactions between individuals so that we can make sure that we're not just translating word to word, but also to culturally understanding and engaging on those various levels. TSA Cares is one of my highlights that I got a chance to work on, where we were able to redesign that website, starting with various groups that would be impacted and designing the site around those various groups. So if you're a person traveling with a service animal, or if you have a disability, or it's religious garb and things that you need to wear, you can get exactly to where you need to go and quickly get the information you need without being bombarded with a lot of other pieces. When I look at my leadership and I look at the landscape as a whole, we can see there's more energy, and people are looking at accessibility as not being a penalty, but rather something that you can use to enhance your services, to reduce overall burden, reduce overall cost, and improve in certain cases revenue. Because if you're taking away the burden that's placed on your customer support agents, because people know what they need to do, now you have increased revenue that you can invest back into building better services.
Thank you, Nicshan. So Genevieve, you have the last question, and before we jump to the questions from the audience, but I do want to go off and remind people that we do need to go off, and please post your questions to the chat so that we can have those going. So your question, Genevieve, is CX and service design is something that you know very well, and universal design. How do we begin to incorporate this into accessibility? How do we try and make sure that it's something that is incorporated into a practice? And as we're trying to build out a service design model, how do we try and make sure that accessibility is bolted into that process?
Yeah, and I think it's the same answer we've heard repeated throughout the panel, which is we have methods that can help us. So we have service mapping, we have bringing in the people who are going to be affected by this service to weigh in, which for us, and I think for most people on the call, very importantly includes your government stakeholders, your frontline staff. Who's going to answer the phone? Who's going to be the first layer of support or even escalated support? And really mapping out what are all those touch points? What channels are they coming in through? And what does accessibility mean within that context. And we often find that certainly for beneficiaries, but often for staff too, there are archetypes, behavioral archetypes that we need to be thinking about accessibility in slightly different ways for. So I think there's that to get at some of those universal design principles, which is anyone can use it in any context. And that's often the spirit, I think, of what a lot of the accessibility guidelines and certainly a lot of the conformance statements are pushing toward. Yeah, it's not anything new. We take these methods and we apply them. And I think we really push to have it not just be, it's not just on the government, it's not just on vendors, it's not just on product owners. There has to be a shared understanding of what accessibility and really universal design means in this space in order to really get there.
Yeah, and if I may add on to that, it really is key to understand where those key touch points are, because you may build a very accessible product, but then you deploy it in a means that makes it no longer usable or accessible. So you need to think about that digital touch point, that physical touch point, and the human interactions, because it's also important that people understand their rights and how to go about getting additional services and support if they needed to. And lastly, when we're looking at developing our products, if you're government, it's very key that you make sure that you work with your procurement agencies and you put everything into this procurement, because you don't want the vendor bidding on supporting you, but then not have the necessary funds to develop the right solution for you. They can't build something when the requirements aren't there. So every party that's involved, from your developer to your business analyst, need to understand their role and responsibility to help ensure success.
That's wonderful. We don't have any questions in the chat. So if people want to ask questions, feel free to raise your hand. I'm happy to go off and to have people ask short, precise questions to our panelists. If people don't have comments, I have lots more. I could ask questions for the next 2 or 3 days, but anyone want to jump in? Okay, I will ask the next one while people are waiting. And I'm just going to make this an open-ended one for anyone. What role do accessibility statements have in improving accessibility, and what are agencies doing to improve them?
I think it's still working on culture. It's telling the story. And the better the story you can tell, the more you're going to get people to buy in. I don't want people thinking I need to make things accessible because it's the law. I want people thinking I'm going to want to make things accessible because I'm going to produce a better product. If we look at the digital age that we live in today, there are a lot of accessibility features that everybody leverages without even realizing that they're using the accessibility functionality. So whenever you look at large companies that feel that it's important they include these in their products, then government as a whole should also say there's benefit here, because someone could have a short-term disability, or they could be in a unique situation where having these enhanced features and functionality benefits them. And if you don't think about it as I'm doing something special for a small group of people, now you're willing to say, I'm willing to invest the time and the effort is to build a much better product, because the payoff is going to be much greater down the road.
This is Andrew. I think +1 on what Nick said. I think with this new guidance from OMB that requires accessibility statements, but requires specific things in those accessibility statements for agency websites, a public feedback mechanism, and how to avail yourself of that public feedback mechanism, and how to file a complaint under Section 508, in addition to having points of contact information. But those other requirements for your accessibility, those two in particular, feedback mechanism and complaints process, that has some process behind it. So it encourages agencies, of course, if you're going to, now that you need to put that on your website in your accessibility statement per the OMB memo, maybe you need to make sure that you have that process in place and that you can really take care of and address a complaint or an issue when it's raised. So those are, in addition to just simply being an indication, or maybe just meeting the mail of including an accessibility statement, that there hopefully there's some meat there too, that there's some process involved when I put that accessibility statement out there.
That's great. And just wanted to say that the panelists can also ask questions, but we have 2 questions from the audience. And the first one is from Jenna Clark. Nice to see you, Jenna. I'm curious to hear about how other agencies have been able to successfully shift left through an organization, not just the left of the digital transformation teams, but all the way through to the folks who create benefits and services. Anyone want to take that?
So if we're talking about other agencies, I do know there's a lot of work or coordination work being done with the Social Security Administration, the Veterans Administration. And then, of course, when we look at Department of Homeland Security, you have Customs Border Patrol, ICE, etc. So there's tons of groups that are there. And what we've been trying to do as a part of the various COPs that are under GSA and the Access Board is making sure that we're standardizing approaches, but also to providing a unified voice for guidance so that as a whole, all agencies can be tackling the problems in similar ways, but also to looking for ways to make enhancements and improvements.
That's great. Anyone want to add on that?
I will. I seldom pass on an opportunity, I guess, to give my opinion. But yeah, Jenna, I think really what you're referring to, sorry if I mispronounced your name, but I think what you're talking about really is cultural change. And that in my world of Section 5 weight conformance, I often am focused in on what's that end process? Did it come out conformant? And of course, there are all kinds of steps before that. And we do try to encourage further and further left. But I think you're talking even more about, this is not just a development process, whether we're talking about application development or we're talking about content development. This really is a cultural approach. And that takes change agents, it takes leadership involvement, it takes a lot of really meaningful effort from a lot of folks to get that to be just a natural part of the way that we go about our lives and our daily work. And we do see, I think, some really positive indications where, maybe in particular, where we have some leadership support at an agency or an organization, a company, where leadership really makes it a priority that our stuff needs to be accessible. And that doesn't just mean the content that we produce, but that means our interactions with one another. And that becomes just part of the dialogue. It's just the way that we talk to one another, interact with one another. And I don't have a silver bullet for that, but I do think that often it has to do with not only leaders, but also, I hate to use the word influencers. It's not a social media thing. People who are important in your organization, the people we know and trust, that it's also not a popularity contest, that people that we do trust, that we have respect for in the workplace. When we see them behaving a certain way or implementing certain practices, and we see the benefit that it brings, then we want to do likewise. And so it does take adoption from some of those really forward-charging change agents, in this case for accessibility.
That's great. So we've got a question now from Sarah Gray, and I think that, Genevieve, this is probably a good one for you to answer. Do you have any additional thoughts for local governments? I'm on the local county level working with low-code, no-code platforms, looking to build robust, accessible practices when we aren't able to customize much. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, and also thank you for the question, and been there. In my previous life, I worked with the city of New York, and that's a totally different beast on its own, but sometimes we are really locked in to these platforms. And I think one of the things that I really try to keep in mind in conversations like these is that for so many services, we really are still starting with the basics. And so many government interfaces are just content. We just are explaining what will happen, what has happened, what needs to happen next. And so I think a lot of no-code, low-code platforms, updating just the written content can be one of the only things we have within our sort of control, or one of the easy things we can do. And user testing the content you already have. So putting a page that you suspect might be a pain point for folks, and saying, what do you think this means? Or if you needed to answer this question, what do you think the answer would be? And having people talk you through that can help you get to plainer language. So that gets to some of those like cognitive aspects of accessibility. You might find that we need to break down some steps, be really clear about those, really avoid complex and ambiguous language. Or depending on the constraints of your platform, there might be an opportunity to add something visual to explain the concepts that you're trying to get across. And so I would say, if you are locked into no code, look at what you can do with your content.
Just on that note, it occurs to me that two things we could potentially extend this point a little bit further. One is talking about procurement. It's at that point when you buy that low code, no code solution that you have the most leverage to go off and to bring in accessibility into that. And it's something where you're not necessarily able to go off and do it as a small local agency, but if you work with hundreds or thousands of local agencies who are all trying to accomplish the same goal with the same client, you have a huge amount of power. So again, if anyone has any thoughts on that. The other is ATAG, the Authoring Tool Accessibility Guidelines. Anytime we're trying to go off and to build tools where authors are creating, we're trying to create content with those tools, we need tools that can help us. And I think that the ATAG, this WC3 guideline, is a really useful tool to that. But if anyone wanted to talk about either the procurement angle or about the ATAG and authoring angle, that would be a nice little follow-on question.
Yeah, Mike, you took the words out of my mouth. The same thoughts came to my mind. It's very likely that you're not the only one using that low code, no code, but engaging with the provider or the vendor as a very small entity is, I think we've all had our own frustrations in some of those same kinds of situations, but engaging, finding others, whether it's state or locals or federal agencies that are using the same tools and engaging together to make change. Certainly at the procurement point, but after the fact, when you already have the product, it can also be very worthwhile to engage with others who are experiencing the same issues, and take that to the provider, the vendor. Along the same lines, for some tools, there are some very engaged user communities that also have really useful guidance on how to use those tools in accessible ways or workarounds and or customizations. So even though it's a low code, no code environment, sometimes there are ways to maybe add some JavaScript or whether maybe you need some administrative privileges to implement some of that and make good friends with your IT folks. Others you can do on your own at the user level. You can make some of those modifications, and there are some great user communities out there for some of those tools where somebody has figured that out already and offered that as a solution, whether it's to improve contrast or make sure that your structure is the way that you want it when you present it. So anyways, yeah, I think there are some meaningful ways to engage.
And I was going to just add, when we talk about overcoming some of the language barriers and making sure that we're clearly communicating at the right level, look for apps out there that could support some of those efforts. So we can look at things with our own eyes, and our brains will override what our eyes are seeing and lie to us. Sometimes you can use some type of screen reader to listen to it. And the other thing you can use is apps like the Hemingway app, not endorsing it, but it is one of those apps that will analyze what you've written, tell you what grade level you wrote it at, how complex your sentences are, make some suggestions on how to break those sentences down, if they're run-on or if they are passive voice versus active voice, etc. All these things can make a massive improvement on how you convey your message.
What was that you mentioned, Nick? Sorry, I didn't catch it.
The Hemingway app.
Amy, I just want to ask you one question here before we get to the closing. And we haven't talked about the addition that you've added or your team's added to the USWDS around testing and the testing tools that you built into the accordion, link, and button elements and how you're trying to build that out. Could you talk a little bit about that so that people can understand how that testing component is now being built into that design system? Because I think that's a really interesting innovation that almost, I don't think there's any other design system that's gone that far to go off and express that. So I think it's a really useful thing for people to know about.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Mike. Speaking of other design systems, I looked at about 50 of them. I know there are more, but I was doing sort of a lit review of all the design systems out there to see what they were doing that worked and stuff that we could borrow ideas from, and then what was missing. And I put myself in the shoes of, because I've been in this position before, of a team that just doesn't have a lot of people on it, but I've been told to make stuff compliant and stuff like that. And so how do I do that if I don't exactly know how mechanics of how to test? Because you might have something like Lighthouse or Wave, and you can get by with some semi-automated things, but ultimately, like, I didn't really know, especially a few years ago when I worked for the state, like, how do you actually test something? And then, like, the WCAG guidelines are super confusing, ironically. And so that kind of thing led me to be like, what would I want? Well, I would want a step-by-step hand-holding. And so that's pretty much what made those checklists. So we're going through, it's a dual process. We're going through, my teammate and I, auditing the design system component by component. I'll audit one, she then re-audits it. So we look at each other's work, make sure we didn't miss anything. And then we send it on to our content team. Our content team writes the prompt, rewrites our admittedly sometimes convoluted prompts into a more plain language, even voice. So that makes a little bit more sense. And then it goes to our dev, who she's got a really good knack with layout and words and everything. And so there's several of us looking at these to make sure they make sense to us. And then make sure that they're consistent and they're easy to follow. And so each component, there basically is a level of responsibility everybody who uses a design system they have that level. If we can get you about halfway there. And that's if you just use it straight out of the box and you're just sticking it on the page by itself. But at that point, I would hear miscellaneous people in chat and things saying, oh, we use USWDS. It's totally accessible. I'm like, whoa, I don't know what you're doing with it after you take it. Use as directed. So we don't really know exactly what people are doing with stuff after they take it. And I've seen people like, oh, I took the accordion and I made tabs out of it. I'm like, oh, I can't tell you if that's accessible. So at that point, if they're claiming that they're using USWDS, I'm like, you're using a version of USWDS. I don't know what you did to it after that. So it was a tool to make sure that people knew that they still had a role to play in making things accessible, but at the same time, assuring them that at least what we're delivering is accessible, and then giving them the tools they needed to go back and check that particular component. And so it's a very atomic view of a design system. It's just piece by piece. At some point, we are going to expand this into more patterns, how to make sure your whole form is compliant, because then you get into like error handling and things like that it's harder for us to
that's wonderful. Yeah, I got to cut you off though, because we're just at time. So I just wanted to go off and wrap up and say thank you everyone for your participation in this. This has been a very interesting discussion. What's very clear is that this is a great time to be involved in accessibility. There's so much going on and so much more that we could talk about. And I hope that everyone has a great rest of your Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And hopefully we'll have more opportunities to go off and to engage in the year to come. Let's make every day Global Accessibility Awareness Day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, panelists.
Thank you.